You are now listening to Protecting Your Nest with board-certified family medicine and obesity medicine specialist Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com. Welcome to the Protecting Your Nest podcast. Most of us are aware of the leading causes of death. The first two that come to mind include, number one, heart disease, and then most of us think about cancer as being number two. Preventing and recovering from both are fundamental if we are to achieve the longevity many of us are seeking. It's just logical, in my mind, to focus on medical conditions that are more likely to impact us than the ones that are less likely to impact us. It's really the key to protecting our nests. So today we will spend some time with our guests so that we can better understand cancer and how that understanding can be vitally important for anyone who may face that battle in the future. The reality is that either you, someone you love or know, will one day desperately need this information. I have learned that the value of being a continuous learner is that when faced with a challenge or the need to help someone, you already have the information tucked away in your toolkit ready to serve you or someone else just in time. So for today's lesson, I have asked my new friend and guest, Martha Tettenborn, to take us to class. Subject for today's class, cancer. Martha is a registered dietitian, now serving as a health coach. Martha is also a cancer survivor which was inspired to write her book called Hacking Chemo, using a ketogenic diet, therapeutic fasting, and a kick-ass attitude to power through cancer. Martha has an inspiring story, which I feel will add tremendous value as we see the world through the lens of a nutrition professional who was able to think outside the box. So with that, all the way from the other side of my northern border in Canada, I welcome you, Martha, to Protecting Your Nest.
Thank you, Tony. Welcome to Central Ontario. It's nice to be talking to you.
Absolutely. Thank God for technology and all of that good stuff. I feel like I've traveled the world just by sitting at my desk and having these conversations. So I really appreciate that. And that bold and impressive title, I must say, to your book. And my goodness, and you're actually a bold and impressive person, just having the courage to go against the mainstream as you share your message of healing. And it made me really think about my first question for you, which is essentially, thinking about you as a renegade low-carb dietitian in a world where most in your field have been educated in their craft of nutrition, that wellness is about balanced eating, and any talk of keto or low carb is just not acceptable, but, could in some cases put a dietitian's license in jeopardy, what I've seen locally in America. So how did you become a renegade low-carb dietitian, knowing that you would be an outlier as you go against conventional wisdom?
Well, I'm of the age that I have been using a low-carb diet for the last 5 or 6 years. But prior to that, I was educated in the low-fat paradigm. In fact, I started university in 1980, which is the very year of the McGovern Commission report, which suggested that low-fat diet was appropriate and preferred for everybody, the entire population. And it was considered cutting edge science at the time, and everything in nutrition shifted to that perspective. So that's how I practiced for probably the first 20 to 25 years of my practice. And I will say that I don't really think I was all that successful in really helping people with their health using a low-fat type diet that allowed people to have processed foods and have sugar and things like that. I started probably in about 2007, 2008, looking at other alternatives and kind of broadening my thinking outside the box a little bit. And that's when I came up against the idea that fat was not the devil, and that perhaps there was something to this low carb, more ancestral way of eating. I ended up becoming very involved with the forums at Mark's Daily Apple, Mark Sisson's site. And eventually, when I was looking for more education a couple of years ago, I did the Primal Health Coach certification through his program called the Primal Health Coach Institute. So it's been quite a journey from rabid low fat to a high fat, low carb evangelist. I promote usually for most people a low carb, healthy fat approach, but there are certain places where a stricter ketogenic diet definitely has therapeutic effects. Now, I will say that it is becoming less of a renegade position to support low carb nowadays, because for one thing, the everybody is finally coming to the realization that cholesterol and saturated fat are not precursors to heart disease. And the Diabetic Association is actually now acknowledging that a low carb or a very low carb diet are acceptable alternatives for treating diabetes. And that took place in the United States a year or two ago, and has finally, within the last year, been accepted by the Canadian Diabetic Association as well in their new position statement. So I'm less renegade than I used to be,
Right.
but I'm happy with where I'm at.
I love it, and I agree. I don't want to be a renegade. I would prefer that we have agreement that at least what Nina Teicholz would say when I talked to her recently about the nutrition guidelines, the dietary guidelines, she said we just need it to be an option. That's all. We don't, everybody doesn't have to be low carb or keto or carnivore, but we need it to be an option. And although we may think it's the best option, we just want people to have that option in front of them. And I do appreciate the Primal Health Coach Institute, because I think the more we have organizations that help us, kind of have a way to legitimize us, and we have some guidelines by which we do our work, I think that's very helpful as well. So I'm very happy that that's available. And I'm a huge fan of coaching, and I've seen really some great work being done with that model, and people do much better when they have somebody that's kind of holding their hand. So you are a clinician, but you also have your own cancer story to tell. I really want my audience to see the world through your lens as you share your story. So share how you ended up with your cancer diagnosis and what your treatment process was like.
Sure. Well, I have been extremely healthy. And in fact, I was quite smug about the fact that I was really healthy. Kind of needed a slap up the side of the head, I guess. And that's what the cancer diagnosis certainly gave me. So about 2 years ago, it was the middle of summer, and I was feeling perfectly fine. I wasn't fitting into my pants as well as I should, and I just figured I hadn't sort of lost my winter weight that I usually go up and down about 5 pounds between summer and winter. And one day in the middle of summer, a friend texted me and said, "So, what are you up to on your plank?" Because she'd been working on her plank, and she knew that I was going to try and work on my plank, and I really hadn't. I'd kind of fallen off the wagon. So I laid down on the floor right then and there, and I got into position to do a plank. And the moment I laid down on my belly, I realized there was something hard in my lower abdomen that had never been there before. So it was just an absolutely out of the blue sort of experience, but I'm not one to kind of shut my eyes and go la 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 and pretend something hasn't happened. So I just sat up right there on my living room floor, and I called my doctor and said there's something that needs to be looked at. Of course, in socialized medicine in Canada, you don't tend to get in like tomorrow, but I got in about 5 days later. But in the meantime, of course, I did what I usually do, which is to go to Dr. Google and see if I could diagnose myself. And I had pretty much convinced myself that I had a uterine fibroid or something, and it needed to come out. But when I went to the doctor 5 days later, she palpated my lower abdomen and made a whole lot of unencouraging, nondescript sort of noises, and sent me off to get an urgent ultrasound. And that took another 5 days, only just because it was a weekend. And the day I had the ultrasound, I found out that I had a huge ovarian cyst. This cyst was just a big fluid-filled sac, but when they diagnosed it, it was already about 16 centimeters across. So that's about 6 inches. And it was a good size. So I started down the path of referral to a gynecologist to have the cyst removed. They did blood work to see whether it might be cancer, but the blood work was non-conclusive. It was just marginally up, and it's not a particularly effective test. It's called a CA-125. And so nobody thought it was cancer. Nobody. The gynecologist didn't. And so we made the decision to have surgery to remove it because it was too big to ignore. And I had it removed at the end of September. It kept growing that whole time. So by the time it was removed, they took out 1.5 liters of fluid off of this cyst. So that's about 1.5 quart if you think about the size of a carton of milk or something. So it was a lot. And I had it ruptured inside my body and removed through a little tiny laparoscopic incision, which was my choice because, again, nobody thought that we were dealing with anything more than just a big fluid-filled cyst. And 6 days after the surgery, while I was at home just sort of recovering and taking it easy, I got a phone call one afternoon, and the doctor's office said, "The doctor wants to see you. Come tomorrow morning, bring another set of ears." And I immediately knew what that meant. So that's how I found out that I had ovarian cancer, stage 1. I was very lucky that it was caught at stage 1 because ovarian cancer is a hard one to diagnose and it is seldom caught early. Only about 20 to 25% of women diagnosed with ovarian cancer will get diagnosed in stage 1. Most of them are diagnosed at stage 3 or 4 when it becomes a much more complicated issue. So I feel very fortunate that the cyst was too big to ignore and that it was taken out when it was, and that I was diagnosed early in the process. However, it was ruptured inside me because it was so big, and they were unable to prevent that, what they called it a spill. And because of that, I was referred to a cancer oncology program, and the oncologist highly suggested that I have hysterectomy, like further surgery, to remove the rest of my female apparatus, which I was all done with at the age of 58 anyways. And then he highly recommended that I have chemotherapy in case of any cancer cells that were released in the rupture of the cyst. So that's kind of where I ended up going down the path of chemotherapy treatment.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's an interesting story, and you're right. The size is big. I think that was a gift for you, although it didn't help in terms of having to have it ruptured as they were trying to help you. But I think that size. I mean, I actually, while you were talking, I said, well, what's the normal size of an ovary? And I looked it up. It was about 2.5 centimeters to maybe up to 5. And even though that was in inches, I mean, you're looking at, that's about 5 times the size of a normal ovary. So that's pretty big. And I'm just happy that it was big enough for you to notice it, because ovarian cancer can get really ugly and can metastasize, and it can really, in fact, a lot of young people end up with this type of cancer. So I'm just happy that you're your cancer got big enough that you would notice. So cancer is a scary word. And one of my previous guests was Dr. Cherie Prentice, and she was a spokesperson for breast cancer for years, and as a public speaker. But she talked about her battle with breast cancer, and I told her that my mom had to battle breast cancer as well, and it really hits home when your mom gets diagnosed with it. And that was about 21 years ago for her. But during my research for you, I learned that your mom also had a battle with breast cancer. So why don't you tell the listeners your mom's story as well?
Sure. Well, it's really interesting because, of course, the first thing you get asked when you're diagnosed with cancer, particularly any sort of hormonal cancer, is, do you have a family history? And I do have a family history. My mother was diagnosed with breast cancer when she was about 45, premenopausally. This was in 1969, so it was very early before chemotherapy existed and in the very earliest stages of radiation therapy. She had a horrible surgery called a radical mastectomy that just took everything right up into her armpit and her chest wall and everything. I was 9 years old at the time. So my mother had cancer while I was still a child and through most of my teen years. It took almost 10 years for the cancer to finally come back, and she went through further treatment, and she died when I was 18, almost 19. But my mom was an outlier because of her past medical history. And so she had polio when she was 7 years old. This was in the Depression and in a very rural farming area of central Ontario. And so she didn't get a lot of medical care, but she grew up quite physically deformed or disabled by the polio having gone through her. And she had a number of different surgeries and who knows what in terms of medications and stresses. And, it's hard to know what they did to young women in the 40s who were dealing with that kind of medical condition. And she also was, as I say, from a very rural area. So there may have been things that were available in an urban setting that weren't available to her. But her family has no history of cancer. Her two sisters are still alive and well in their late 80s and mid 90s. Her mother and her aunt and her cousins all lived well into their mid 90s. So they're very long lived and very healthy people. And so I never considered myself to have an increased risk because of my mother's breast cancer diagnosis, despite the fact that I lost her very early.
I'm thinking about a few things when you're talking. Number one, this idea of cancer, and we think about our histories and what's our risk factors. And I know when as I've studied in school, we talked about mutations and how your genes are impacted by your environment. There's just so many factors that increase our risk or make us, at risk. And it's hard to always piece it together. So who knows what that thing was for you or your mom. But I do know that part of this Protecting the Nest podcast is to always think about what can we do? What are that nest and rope, that acronym? What are the things I can do to mitigate that risk and reduce it? So, and I'm studying toxicology right now. And in those studies, I'm thinking about my deodorant now. Every time I try to do a natural deodorant, it's like it doesn't work very well because it's deodorant. It's like I use an antiperspirant. I'm a man, But but I'm still searching because I do want to mitigate my risk. I want to, what can I do to reduce my risk? And I think that's one thing that came to mind. The other thing is, I didn't know about your mom having polio, and I have a couple of family members with polio. And I bring that up because of the vaccine question. So I just want the listeners to know that the next episode that I record, I'm going to talk about COVID vaccines, just to kind of give a perspective. The goal is not to convince people as much as is to make sure they have enough information so that when they're making decisions for their family, they'll, have everything they need to make that decision. And then the decision you make is your own. But I just want to just put that little commercial out there as well. So, but
Absolutely. I
yeah.
totally support the vaccine. And I can tell you that I've had the first vaccine shot a week ago. It was the first day it was available in my county. And because I work in long-term care, I was eligible to get it. And I was there with bells on. So
I know.
had my
Yeah.
first one.
Yep, and I've had mine. I had my second dose a week ago, and I did really well. So hopefully we'll ramp that up and continue that journey. So now, let's think about nutrition a little bit. I'd be remiss if we didn't, make the connection between what you eat and cancer. So let's take a moment to talk about why our diet can impact the metabolism of cancer, and especially that sugar and insulin connection. Because, obviously if you do a low carb diet, you're going to reduce insulin. Obviously you're not consuming sugar, but talk a little bit about that, because I think people really need to hear that connection.
Yeah, well, you know what? As a dietitian, I didn't even know there was a connection until I started down this rabbit hole of research for my own purposes. We had just always assumed that cancer is a disease of genetic mutations, and you get enough genetic mutations piled up, then cancer happens. And I had no idea that there was actually a whole field of study called cancer metabolism. As a dietitian, all we were ever told was that we were basically to use kind of whatever you could get into somebody to help them to not lose weight and not lose strength during the chemotherapy or the cancer treatment process, whether that's surgery or radiation or chemotherapy. Basically to help them eat kind of around the side effects, because the side effects of the treatments were so severe that people would lose ground health-wise because of them. And so we would use what we called the high energy, high protein diet. And that was using the concept of nutrient density, where you pile extra fat or extra sugar into foods to try and give more calories in a smaller package so that people could eat what they could tolerate, but eat enough that they didn't lose weight and lose muscle mass. And that was really all we knew, and using nutritional supplements. That was the other thing, was we were always, pushing the commercial supplement products as a way of getting that nutrient density. So when I went looking for myself, I started, doing some research, again, Dr. Google, and lo and behold, I discovered this entire field of cancer metabolism, where researchers are starting to understand that cancer cells, generally almost all of them, have a disordered metabolism. Which means they have a disordered way of using their energy or creating their energy. They don't do it like a normal cell, and they do it in a different way. And they have a voracious appetite for energy, particularly in the form of sugar. This is because they don't have the normal cellular metabolism that healthy cells do for using either sugar or fatty acids or ketone bodies or whatever fuel happens to be around. Cancer is pretty much an obligate glucose burner, meaning that it can only use glucose or blood sugar. And so the cells are looking for blood sugar all the time. That also means that on the surface of the cell, there's extra insulin receptors to try and get the energy inside the cell so that it can be burned. Turns out this information was known like 100 years ago almost. In the 1920s and 30s, there was research on cancer metabolism. In fact, one researcher, a German man named Otto Warburg, won the Nobel Prize in 1931 for his work on cancer metabolism. And we still talk about the way that cancer uses energy as the Warburg effect. But After the Second World War, Germany lost the war, and most things German weren't considered in very high regard. And of course, most of his research would have been published in German. And shortly after that, they discovered the double helix. They were able to actually identify DNA and what it does. And then they were able to identify that cancer had mutations on their DNA, and the entire multi-billion-dollar machinery of the cancer treatment industry swung over towards genetics and genetic mutations and just sort of left metabolism on the dust heap of history. And it stayed there for quite a long time until the last 20 years or so, when some researchers have now started to bring it back into the foreground and are doing some amazing research and having some really significant findings around how cancer metabolizes energy and how that can be used to impact on the cancer growth and the vitality of the cancer cells themselves. It becomes a very powerful tool.
Yeah, it is. And it's like, again, that's why I'm still in school. I'm like, did we learn anything when we were in school? Or, it's almost like they took some chapters out. And then the fact that I understand why there would be some hesitation because of the Germany thing. But my goodness, science is science. And you hate that it's politics and other things get in the way of that. So you really made me think about the one that we respect so much, which is Dr. Jason Fong, because I'm sure you read his book. Did you read his new book about cancer?
Oh God, yeah, I had it on pre-order. It dropped into my Audible account the day it was released, and I had the whole thing read in about 3 days, and then I went through and read it again. It's
My goodness.
mind-blowing. He does such a good job of explaining kind of what cancer is.
Yeah, we need him to, he's just a great leader in terms of just thinking outside the box, like we started with. And I thank God for that. So for anybody listening, although we want you to definitely buy Martha's book, we also want you to, if you want to understand a different way of looking at cancer, I think Dr. Jason Fung's book, is it the Cancer Code? Is that what it's called?
The Cancer Code, yes.
I just want to make sure. I hadn't gotten it yet, but it's definitely on my to-do list. So I just wanted to bring that up because, again, we're here to teach and provide that knowledge. So it seems that, in conventional medicine, most clinicians are just not trained to connect the dots between cancer and how its metabolism can be addressed with diet. So any additional thoughts on the knowledge gap that seems to exist with cancer docs who should know this stuff code, and dietitians as well? That knowledge gap about sugar and cancer and what's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's bizarre, but there are so many gazillions of dollars that have been invested in the genetic model of cancer and how to impact on that through chemotherapy and radiation and all that sort of stuff. And the diagnoses and everything. There's so much focus on genetics that it's one of those follow the money sort of scenarios. When you're looking at for the reason behind things, people keep saying follow the money, and I really think that that's a lot of the reason why it's difficult. I'm not saying people don't want to be effective and they don't want to move forward, but holy cow, the entire infrastructure of cancer treatment almost needs to be revamped in order to incorporate this new knowledge about cancer metabolism. I know that when I was going through cancer treatment, I was referred to a large cancer center about 3 hours away from where I live, because I'm in a pretty rural part of Ontario. And this was a huge cancer catchment center that did chemo and radiation and attached to a big hospital that did the surgeries and everything. And they are wonderful people doing a hard job, but they were not aware of the stuff that I was aware of in terms of cancer and the metabolic impacts. And I did tell them what I was doing. I always say that it's really important that your health team knows what you are doing if you are going to make nutrition interventions part of your treatment for cancer. But there was no support for it. So nobody said I couldn't do it. My oncologist's response was sort of, well, different things work for different people. And I'm sure he's had probably people come into his clinic who have said, oh, I've adopted a raw vegan diet to cure my cancer or something. And so he was pretty nondescript in terms, even though I handed him probably 40 pages of abstracts and evidence and stuff from all the articles that I had downloaded and printed. I gave him this big packet of stuff. But anyways, yeah, they didn't say I couldn't, but in terms of my own dietary interventions that I had set up for myself. But I did let them know that it was happening.
Yeah. It's just how we're trained. We're trained to, as follow guidelines, follow quote unquote evidence-based medicine. We now know that some of the evidence that we follow, particularly after, again, talking to Nina Teichels, we learned that the new dietary guidelines are not evidence-based. They're epidemiological studies as opposed to, double-blind studies. So I think that sometimes I don't think the average person would know that. I don't think the average doctor would know that. I don't think the average dietitian would know that. So that's why we have to get these messages out. And when it comes to follow the money, I know in the United States, I read a study that was an independent study, and the question was, where, or what are the basic responses to policy based on, what is that based on, right? And when they did the study, they found that 92% of our elected officials' decisions are based on their lobbyists and special interests, right? So they may, whatever they say on the campaign trail is, kind of like not always reflective of what they do. 92%. So if you want to know what a politician is going to do, you just find out who sponsored them. And what would be nice in America, I'm not sure how it works in Canada, if we had a way to eliminate that or to minimize that sponsorship and let the people decide, I think that would be a better model. But again, it's not a political discussion, but you really reminded me of that way of thinking when you talked about follow the money. So,
yeah, you want to know something interesting about the guidelines? I did listen to your podcast with Nina.
Okay, good.
Is that Canada just came out with new guidelines like a year and a half ago, maybe 2 years ago. And when they were starting the process of looking at revising the guidelines, which took place over the last 5 years ago or so, one of the things that they chose to do, that committee, is they refused to accept submissions from industry interests. So they, so the dairy farmers and the beef farmers and the grain, producers and the sugar people and all that, they were not willing to accept input from actual producers. They wanted input from scientists. And, that in itself caused quite a stir because, meat and dairy are big politically active policies.
That's right.
And they, each of those sections had their own spot on the food guide and stuff. And in the end, what they came out with was better in some ways, certainly than the old one. Still a little more plant focused than I would have liked, but that's just my perspective. But certainly it is something that I can get behind more than the old one was. So just as an aside, that's kind of the politics of how Canada chose to do it.
One of the things that I asked Nina, and she actually asked me to clarify, and we talked about, I had asked her about the ways that you can determine if a study is going to be, something that can actually show cause. And so one of the things I asked her about was bias, and she shared when we talked about, you remember when I brought up chance, she was like, well, speak to that a little bit more. But the bottom line is chance is something that you you're going to always have chance. I mean, that's just the nature of life, chance. But bias is something you can mitigate. And even in further discussions in this research class, we talked about different types of bias. And one is publication bias we talked about. And at the end of the day, if I have a few folk on the committee or who are part of the team, the researchers who are vegan or carnivore, that's going to bias them. It's going to bias them to want the results to be a certain way. And if they don't look a certain way, they may not even publish the study. If things are not looking the way they want them to look. So again, part of the thing I want people to do, as I've had to learn to do, is always have one eye open, one closed. Always use caution when you're looking at things. Always look for the things that could cause bias. And these are the things that I'm reviewing now as I study. But as a clinician, prior to getting into back to school and being in a low carb space, I just didn't have time to really ask those questions. But now I just kind of force myself to ask the question, or at the minimum, hear what other people are asking. If I don't have time, maybe Dr. Kim Berry took some time to look at the data more closely, or some of our other colleagues. So I really appreciate that. I am curious because this whole cancer metabolism idea, we just talked about the knowledge gaps that our cancer doctors may have. The question is, can you talk a little bit more about where you got your knowledge from? I mean, what people did you read or follow that gave you this information?
Well, YouTube's a wonderful thing because conferences get posted on YouTube, and that's a lot of what I did when I was starting out. I discovered, and then of course I went to the literature and as well, and followed up on some of those people I'd seen at some of those YouTube conferences to see what kind of work they were actually publishing. So one of the people who's doing a lot of the foundational work is Dr. Thomas Seyfried. He's in Boston, and he's looked at the metabolism of cancer in his lab for a number of years, and he speaks very eloquently to that. He has developed what he calls the press pulse theory of cancer metabolism, and what the theory sort of states, or how you would use it, is that you can make nutritional choices that will stress the cancer cell. That's the press. So you're providing pressure that makes it difficult for the cancer cell. That's limiting the amount of fuel that you have floating around in your blood, which would be blood glucose and the growth factors like insulin and insulin-like growth factor, or IF1. And those are the things that the cancer cells are voraciously hungry for. And it's really important to remember that a cancer cell doesn't have any kind of off switch. One of the hallmarks of cancer is that it does not have the ability to downregulate its metabolism. So it's starving for this stuff all the time. It can't just calm down if there isn't fuel present. It needs fuel, and it needs those growth factors. So he's done a lot of work around that. Another one that I spent a fair bit of time reading was Dr. Walter Longo, who is a researcher in California. And he's done a lot of work more recently on longevity issues, but in the last 10 or 15 years prior to that, he was working on cancer. And he's the one that was using low-carb and ketogenic diets, and particularly using fasting to impact on cancer cells. So this is another factor of fuel management, where you actually take the fuel completely out of the input of fuel completely out of the system. And again, that applies a lot of pressure to the cancer cells. He did the research to prove that this was not a negative factor on the effectiveness of chemotherapy, because that's really important. You don't want to do something that's going to stress the cancer cells, but that's also going to reduce the power of the intervention that you're supplying. But he did the research to prove that the cancer chemotherapy was actually potentiated or made more effective by using fasting. during the chemotherapy. That's the pulse part of Thomas Seyfried's theory. So the press is supplying, the fuel limitation through your dietary choices so that the cancer cells are stressed, and then you hit them while they're down, and that's the pulse. So having chemotherapy, for example, while they're stressed makes the chemotherapy more effective.
That's
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool theory. People don't realize that food is a message, like food sends a signal. It's a messenger, as well as being fuel. It carries a message to your body. And so you can have huge impacts with your nutrition.
I think everybody listening should go to Amazon and look at the image of your book. It's a beautiful cover. I obviously love the title, even with the kick-ass piece. And this is crazy. And so, but I want people to look at it because it's really cool to kind of see that whole keto food stuff inside that that chemo bag of fluid, I guess. And but it all makes sense now as I hear you talk about this. And and first of all, we talked about Jason Fong. Obviously, he has his intermittent fasting background, but I'm a huge fan of intermittent fasting. I had my first meal today just before we started talking. It was probably around 2:30 or so. But I also saw in your book when I got it that you had this chemo fasting protocol. And, when the average person, look at me and you, their eyes would be crossed when you would suggest that a person with cancer would fast. So I think I'm assuming that came from Walter Longo from California. So my question for you is, what is that protocol? And I assume that it involves, intermittent fasting and some other things. Talk a little bit about that protocol you talked about.
Sure. Well, yes, it does come from the work of Walter Longo. He published in 2009, he published a case series. He'd done a lot of work in everything from worms to rodents and so on, but this was a human case study series that he published of 9 or 10 people who did chemotherapy and used fasting during their chemotherapy treatments to try and mitigate the side effects of the chemo. So different people had different tumors, and they had different periods of time that they would fast, both before and after the chemo, and then they would assess them for the side effects that they experienced. And almost completely, people who fasted through chemo treatments had a lighter, easier time with the side effects than the people who ate through their cancer treatment. And that had a huge impact on me. That was really where it started. These people in the study, most of them would fast through some of their treatments and not fast through other ones. And the ones where they fasted were significantly better in terms of their side effect experience. And I was really impressed by that. When I did it, I refused to be my own control group, and I did not have any of my chemo treatments. I had 6 rounds. I didn't have any of them without being fully fasted because I really didn't want to find out what it was like when you ate through chemo. I wasn't doing it to be a perfect scientific specimen or anything. I was doing it for my own survival. So what I did was I read a lot of these case studies and a lot of his research, and I came up with the idea or the plan. I shouldn't call it an idea because it was evidence-based, that I was going to fast for about 36 hours prior to starting chemotherapy, my actual chemotherapy administration. And then I was going to fast for about 24 hours after my chemo. And my chemo treatment, because it involved both an IV chemo and an interperitoneal chemo, so one of the drugs was drained directly into my abdomen through a port. So my chemo days, my hospital day or clinic days for chemo were about 11 hours long. Like they were really long days. And So the whole chemo period for me ended up being about 72 hours. And so I would fast for that 72-hour period, starting a day and a half prior to my chemo and going for 24 hours after the end of my chemo. And what that actually looked like for me was that every 3 weeks on a Thursday, I would have to drive to London, which is 3 hours from my home, the night before usually, because we were talking dead of winter in Ontario, so the weather was unpredictable to say the least. And I would stop eating on Tuesday after supper, and I would fast all day Wednesday. I would fast all day Thursday, which was my actual day in the chemo clinic in London. And we would drive home Thursday night, the 3 hours. And then I would fast all day Friday until supper time, at which point I would break my fast. So it wasn't a water fast, it was a supported fast. I would use coffee or tea, black, herbal tea, bubbly water, and usually over the course of the 72 hours, I'd have about 3 to 4 cups of bone broth that I would make myself. So it wasn't just straight water. I did have things to sip on that I found satisfying. And so that I kind of coalesced that into what I called the chemo fasting protocol. And it's in the book, but it's also available for free on my website if anyone is interested in just finding out about the chemo fasting protocol. It's the first blog post I ever did. And on the website, if you put in your email address, you can get a download, a one-pager of the actual fasting protocol with day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4 sort of thing.
That's cool. Thank you for doing that. And one of the I want to break it down just a little bit more. So Dr. Hampton's a fifth grader now, and as a fifth grader, I need things to be very simple. So I think about this. Most people are like, "How in the heck is fasting? Any of this stuff's going to help with your symptoms, right?" So when I think about the stomach, that's one of the things that would bother people the most. Could you just go a little bit more nuanced and just based on your experience, why is it that my symptoms are better?
Wow, interesting. This is specific to chemotherapy, and I make it clear that I'm not, curing cancer for the whole world or anything. And this is about managing chemotherapy. And so chemotherapy is basically a poison. It's a very blunt instrument. The idea of the poison is that it's poison enough to kill the cancer cells without killing the host. So it's really hard on your host, which is your person, like your tissues. The way chemo is generally designed is that it is looking for, it is targeted at cells that metabolize rapidly. Because if you remember, the cancer has no off switch. It is always metabolizing. It's always looking for more fuel. It's always trying to grow. So chemotherapy is designed to look for that fast growing signal. And in an adult human in particular, we don't have a lot of parts that are still actively growing because most of our body is finished growing and we're in maintenance mode. But we do have some parts that are rapid metabolizing cells. And if you think about the parts of you that are still growing, one would be your hair. We always have growth on our hair. Another one is that the cells inside our bone marrow are always producing our immune system components and our blood components. So the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, things like that. And we also have pretty fast growing cells that line our digestive tract. They're always turning over. So we're always developing new cells there. And what the fasting does is it puts your healthy cells into a sort of a quiet mode. So when the fuel dries up, we have the ability physiologically to slow down metabolism, and our healthy cells just kind of go into a waiting period or a maintenance mode. I call it stealth mode. And in that mode, they are not sending out the signals of rapid metabolism. And so the chemotherapy literally just kind of flies right over them and misses them. I don't expect it. It makes the cancer cells, I have this vision that it makes the cancer cells sort of stand out like, big red flashing lights on the landscape.
Right.
And so it flies right over the healthy cells and it goes and hits up the cancer cells harder than ever. So my experience was that when I went into chemo treatments in a fasted state, I had my thermos of coffee with me. I had, a water bottle. I had another thermos that I would fill up with tea for the afternoon or whatever. So I was sipping at things, but I never experienced nausea during the treatment day. Never. In fact, I experienced almost no nausea. I never threw up through 6 cancer treatments. I never once had any sort of emesis. I had no joint or muscle aches, which can often be a post-chemo treatment problem. And I had no peripheral neuropathy, which is the nerve damage to your fingertips or the ends of your toes, things like that. I was terrified of peripheral neuropathy because it is a damage that can last for a long time after the chemo is done. And I had none of that. I did lose my hair because that's sort of a second week of chemo lasts like 3 whole weeks in your system, right, before it's kind of out. So the immediate impacts of the cancer treatment itself, that first couple of days, are kind of protected by the fasting that you do before and the 24 hours after the chemo. And then I did lose all my hair, and my blood values for my hemoglobin and platelets and white blood cells and stuff was depressed, but never low enough that I required any sort of medication to help boost it back up again. There are some really good drugs that will do that, but there are also drugs with their own side effects, and I never had to do that. In fact, most of the treatments, every treatment was a little lighter or easier than the one before, and that's opposite to how most people experience chemo.
Right. It usually gets way worse.
It gets way worse. And each treatment, I was able to take less and less of the post-treatment medications. So the steroid and the nausea drugs and stuff that they give you for the first couple of days after chemo, every treatment I took less and less of those. So by the 5th and 6th treatments, I was taking nothing after the day of chemo. And I was fine. I mean, I say fine. I was low energy. I was never bedridden. I never missed a meal. I never missed making a meal because in my house I make the meals. Sometimes it was just bacon and eggs, and I'd climb back in my recliner, But I was never wiped out by the chemo, which I consider pretty amazing.
Yeah, I mean, your book should be required reading for anybody in palliative care and cancer care because they really want patients to not suffer, especially when you think about the role of palliative care. But to not know this mind-blowing information, to imagine going through chemo with minimal nausea, minimal vomiting, or emesis, and not having to deal with neuropathy. And I'll agree with you. When I treat my patients, whether it's a diabetic or someone else, or, someone who had cancer and they have neuropathy, it's a nightmare. It's very difficult and it's very uncomfortable. And sometimes it seems like it just doesn't go away. I mean, it should get better, but not always. So I think what I'm hearing is that intermittent fasting is almost like a PET scan. It's a scan that will help you light up the areas that need to be attacked. They get attacked, but it's hard to promote something that's not profitable. I mean, there's no money in intermittent fasting, but man, if it can help people, it's just mind-blowing. It's mind-blowing that you had that experience, but it's also mind-blowing that you're, again, going back to what I said earlier, I'm asking a cancer patient to fast. It's like so contrary to everything that we teach. And like you mentioned earlier, we tend to feed our patients whatever they'll eat. And it's always the stuff that they should be eating, right? So
Exactly.
it's just crazy. So, but um, I really, really appreciate you sharing that, because I really wanted people to understand this unique approach and how it's really doing something completely different. And and one thing I really like about you is that you have this coaching training. And obviously, with that and your book, you're trying to make an impact. So I want you to talk a little bit about your passion to share this information and obviously change the conversation around cancer, nutrition, and chemo side effects. I mean, talk a little bit about where, it sounds like you're very motivated to do that.
Yeah, when I first discovered this stuff, I was almost angry because like I'm a dietitian and I've been a dietitian for 35 years. Like how come I didn't know this stuff? How come nobody knows this stuff? Like why isn't the whole world on track with cancer metabolism and the power of food and like these interventions don't cost anything, which means that number one, somebody's losing money, but also it means that it's accessible to everybody, right? Jason Fong says this all the time too. It's like fasting is free. Not having to take all those post chemo medications. Like, I mean, I live where I don't have to pay for those things, thank God. My chemotherapy, it was covered by my healthcare. But nevertheless, like in a place where you have to pay for medications, to be able to do something as easy as this, because it really is not that hard, and save yourself money on top of the suffering and everything else. So, I mean, I couldn't believe that this stuff was unknown. And again, it's like you say, it hurts to watch people suffer. And I just want to be able to reduce that suffering. That's kind of why I started the blog. And then once the blog got started, people were like, well, you should maybe write a book. Your writing's pretty good. And so,
Right.
and Lord knows I had enough time to sit around that winter because of the chemo. And yet I wasn't wiped out because of the chemo. So I had time. I'd given up a lot of things to make room for that elephant that plunks down in your living room of your life when you find out you have cancer. I'd freed up a lot of time for that, and then I had the time to do the writing and really think about how I wanted to be able to share this with people.
Was it otherwise, what you have in time to write? Was there other aspects of writing that were difficult since that was a new project for you?
Um, Not overly. I mean, it's something that I started with the blog, so that was a good place to start.
Hmm.
I could write. I wrote about my own experience because when I got the diagnosis, what I really went looking for first when I went diving into Dr. Google was other people's experiences. So I really wanted to find out from other women who had had cancer, possibly ovarian cancer, possibly stage 1 ovarian cancer, gone through the same kind of chemotherapy as me, and all that kind of stuff. I was looking for stories, and it was hard to find them, particularly of women of my age, because YouTube and the internet and stuff tend to be a more comfortable place for a younger generation than mine. So you'd see people who were in their 20s or 30s who were diagnosed with ovarian cancer, and it's a very different experience at that stage in life than it is for a postmenopausal woman. So part of the blog was writing my own experience so that people could find it, because I know that that was what I was looking for. And that's why my story is part of the book as well, because there will be people who just want to hear it from somebody else who's, of a similar age and stage and went through a similar thing. So it wasn't it wasn't hard to write the book. In fact, I will say that writing the book was a passion project, and it was the easy part. Once you get the manuscript done and you've got to figure out the rest of book publishing, that's when it gets really hard. I liked the writing part, though it isn't something that I was, really familiar with. But when it came to the learning curve of the self-publishing aspect of things, oh my lordy, I ended up getting help.
Wow. I remember when I wrote my book, I learned a lot too, like the different types of things that you have, all these different stages and all these different types of edits, and it was like crazy, but it was a nice thing to learn. And the thing I always tell people, I had a good friend speak about writing recently, and I said the main thing is just write it. Don't worry about editing. Just put your thoughts on paper, and they have professional people that'll do that for you. So just get the thoughts on paper, and then all that process stuff will occur. So that's I think it's just, if you have something to say, just say it. It may make a difference. Imagine if you had not written your book. I think, hopefully somebody listening to this, somebody who's read the book, it'll make a huge difference if we can give our loved ones an opportunity not only to treat their cancer in a way that's more tolerable, but hopefully to live a life that'll prevent it from coming back. So, and I really believe in my heart that for most cancers, this way of eating, intermittent fasting, keto, will really help most types of cancers because of this idea of how metabolism of cancer works. So I know in Canada, French is spoken as well as English. So I thank you for allowing me to excuse my French by saying, how in the hell are you able to survive as a dietitian? And I know you're coaching now, but to retain your license in a highly regulated profession, with a licensing board. I mean, that's got to be difficult. There's got to be some limitations. What challenges have you faced trying to teach this message while being a nutrition professional?
Well, yeah, that is a problem, because as a regulated health profession, I have a license that is valid in Ontario, and that is, I'm allowed to counsel patients virtually from other provinces, some other provinces, not all of them, but I have no jurisdiction in the United States, or anywhere else really. So to provide medical nutrition therapy as a registered dietitian, I am not able to do that. But as a coach, if people are clear that what I'm doing is more general in terms of supporting them through cancer, that the chemo fasting protocol is in the book. It's kind of out there as a general educational thing, but I can help people with the process of going through cancer. I just recently, as I was struggling with how to do that, I recently came across the concept of a doula, and I just love it. So a doula, most people know what a doula is in terms of birth, right? So there's the midwife who actually performs a birth, or a doctor performs the birth, catches the baby. But the doula is there for the adult. They're there for the people who are actually going through the process, not the process itself.
Gotcha.
And so they provide support and affirmation and, and hope and hand-holding and, sharing of the experience and all that kind of stuff. And I went looking online, and there are a number of people who do death doula work, helping people, again, through the process of dying. So they're not the clinician. They are the person who supports the person going through the process. And there's one or two people out there in the world who are identifying as cancer doulas. And I thought, dang, that's what I would like to do, is to help people get through the process. Because one of the things that I found with these nutrition interventions is that they give the person going through chemotherapy a sense of empowerment. It's so easy to just feel overwhelmed and powerless in this situation, right? And it's so easy to just kind of go, well, whatever the doctor says, that's what I'll do. And they just, it's almost like they turn their brains off and they stop thinking for themselves because the overwhelm is just too much. And so when you have something that you can do for yourself that is impacting the process, so it's, you know, it's not like, say, you're not actually the clinician, you're not making a difference to what's decided in terms of the cancer treatment and stuff, but you are supporting the person going through the cancer treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of where this intervention fits in and where I would like to be able to kind of move forward. So it's outside the realm of being a registered dietitian. It's more supporting the whole person.
Wow. You know, we're all therapists in the work we do. And I think about, even as I think about the nest and the rope acronym that talks about, you know, things like nutrition, exercise, but it also talks about how we think. It talks about your emotions. It talks about making sure your life experiences actually still serve you. And if they don't, but what I'm hearing is that our mental health is very important in our success with cancer. So speak a little bit about how important you think that is, like rather it's being positive or just being grateful. How have you seen a difference in the people you coach and support, that they do better if they have those things in place?
Oh, absolutely. I really feel that that's what the kick-ass attitude part is about. When I was trying to come up
Got it.
with the title for the book, what I wanted to impart was that we were using a ketogenic diet and therapeutic fasting, but the other thing that we were using was sort of an in control, positive spirit to help ourselves get through cancer. When I look at sort of how people identify with cancer, there are the people who just feel like they're a victim, and you hear that terminology all the time, they're a victim of cancer. And then you also hear a lot of talk about being a warrior and being in a battle with cancer. And neither of those sort of perspectives resonated with me really at all. I refuse to be a victim. I don't want to be pitied. That's not sort of who I am. And I'm an eternal optimist. I'm very much a glass half full sort of person. And I see the good side of just about everything and everybody. So I wasn't willing to just kind of, lay down or roll over and go, do it to me. That wasn't me. But I also feel that being in sort of a battle mentality or a battle mode puts you in a position of being chronically stressed. And I didn't think that that was good either. And I didn't really want to be in that mindset. What I did find was that I needed to come to the realization that cancer is not a foreign invader in my body, that cancer is me, it's my own cells, but they're misguided. They have lost their path. And as such, they don't need to be hated and they don't need to be battled against. I almost felt like it was a situation like the Marie Kondo decluttering sort of thing, where she says, if something no longer belongs in your life, if it doesn't spark joy, or however she puts it, you thank it for its part in your previous life and you let it go. And so I really tried to approach the cancer journey, from a position of love and gratitude for my health and for my support system, my rock stable husband, and my friends, and social media, and my ability to study and learn about these interventions. Living in Canada, where medical treatments don't mean that I'm financially ruined. You have to wait for things sometimes, but the system is there and it works.
We have to
So
wait. We have to wait here, and we don't have universal health care. So I want to be clear. If you want to come see Dr. Hampton, it may take you 3 months. We have to wait here. That's the biggest misperception I think people have. They say, well, in the United States, you can get it done. Now, of course, if you have very deep pockets, you'll always find a way to get things done fast. But people wait here. I
yeah.
mean, yeah, I don't know what the difference is, but I hope people listening understand it. Anybody in America who's listening knows it's true. When you want to get stuff done, you still got to wait.
Mm-hmm. And
Yeah.
that's not the worst thing, because it gives you time to reflect.
Yeah.
I've read stories about people who, got a diagnosis in the morning and by the afternoon they were in surgery. And it's like, you need time to process this stuff
That's right. That's right.
mentally, spiritually, as well as physically and
Hmm.
financially and everything
Hmm.
else. Like, you need time you can't just be thrown into it. And
Yeah.
that's where people start to feel powerless. And so I advocate for taking the time. Nothing's going to change between now and 2 weeks from now in terms of generally for most
Yeah.
people anyways, that you can't take the time to come to grips with what you're dealing with and look at your whole life and where it's going to impact and stuff.
That's right. It sounds like, I mean, obviously you're a coach, and it sounds like you really look at the whole person. You probably look at their family situation, you look at where they are in their life, you probably just take a holistic approach. And it sounds like, even as a clinician, as a doctor on the front lines, I think that that's very important, because there may be some aspects, and that's why, if you think about the nest and the rope, the R is for relationship. So if I'm trying to really help somebody with their diabetes, and I don't, make sure they're in a healthy relationship, I may be, it's going to be impossible to help them. You have to address the relationship. So I assume that as you're interacting with your clients or patients, you take that approach. You're trying to figure out where's the gap, and let's fill that gap so we can then work on the bigger picture.
Mm-hmm. Or help people to at least identify for themselves
Yeah.
where they can get support, and think outside the box of just being, oh well, I live alone, so poor me, you know. But you have to look at where your support comes from, and you have to be willing to accept it. Sometimes you have to be
Hmm.
willing to ask for it, which can be
Hmm.
really hard for some people, like me, who's always in control. I had a really hard time accepting that I was going to be less than perfectly in control and that I needed to let some other people do some things for me, because that was just not part of who I usually am. And I needed to be less of the leader and more willing to receive. So, I had friends who brought food to the house, and it wasn't always something that I could eat because I was very strictly ketogenic for the entire 5 months of my chemotherapy treatment.
Hmm.
But it was always something that my husband could eat, and feeding my caregiver was pretty important to me. So that was, a wonderful gift, right?
Right.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I could understand. I think that's why my mom struggled to not be with me and the rest of the crew for the holidays, because there's a role that she plays, and not being able to feed her, she still calls me her baby. I get that. So you have, and speaking of a nest, your husband obviously is in your nest, and I think you just want to protect your nest. I mean, that's just what you do. So and that's probably why this coaching works so well for you. But speaking of protecting your nest, let me ask you that question about you and how you plan to do that over the next year. So, the nest obviously represents nutrition, exercise, less stress, more sleep, how we think, avoiding trauma. And the rope represents relationships that add value, avoiding organisms and pollutants, and making sure our emotions and life experiences serve us well. So, as you think about 2021, where do you plan on focusing your attention personally?
Personally, I am looking forward to being able to be more physically present in relationships again. I am a hugger by nature, and this has been really hard being separated from my social, particularly my friends. I still have one of my sons who's in my bubble. He's an adult, developmentally challenged, lives independently, but he's single and he's in my bubble. But my other son lives in Ottawa, which is 7 hours away, and I haven't seen him hardly at all through this whole thing. So in the next year, I hope to continue to promote my book and get the message out about the power of nutrition to impact cancer. And the more I do that, the more I feel like I'm making a significant contribution to the world. And in the meantime, I will continue to work in my long-term care homes and look after those vulnerable elderly who are at such risk of the pandemic. And that's a stressful place to be, but I also feel it's a very important place to be.
Yeah, I there was a time when I kind of was not that excited about dealing with difficult topics like cancer, but now I have a different perspective, which is who would I want those people to hear from and talk to in that moment? A doctor who will be passionate or compassionate and will hold their hand and let them shed a tear, or a doctor who's treating them like a number. So I think now I look at it completely differently. And I really appreciate a lot of the things you talked about your personality and who you are. I'm a positive person as well. So, all of those things resonate with me. So I'm happy that a person like you is in a position to do the work that you do. So as we wrap up, any final thoughts? And of course, make sure everybody knows how to get your book and just find you if you're on social media.
Sure. Well, in terms of final thoughts, I guess I just go back to the idea that the cancer is a journey, and that it can give you as many gifts as you are willing to receive in terms of mental and spiritual bonuses that you look for. You always have to look for the positive. And try not to feel powerless. You have a lot of power in your own ongoing journey, however that ends up looking. And be willing to be in relationship with other people, because that's so incredibly important in maintaining your own, not just physical strength, but your own emotional and mental and spiritual strength, and connect to universal love and universal power, however it is that is defined in your life, whether you call it God or whether you get out in nature or whatever. There is a bigger power that we are all part of, and connecting to that is incredibly strengthening. So the book is Hacking Chemo is available on all the Amazon platforms in all the countries that Amazon is in. It's available both as an ebook and as a print-on-demand paperback. It's also available through Barnes & Noble in the States, and Chapters Indigo in Canada, which is sort of our version of Barnes & Noble, and independent booksellers as well. So if you just Google either my name or you Google the title of the book, Hacking Chemo, it'll come up in a variety of places.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure, of course, to share any links that we need to. And I really thank you, Martha. You're going to think I'm joking when I say this, but there are times when you're speaking, I close my eyes and I just meditate, because the things you're saying resonate, and they are the types of messages people need to hear. So I really appreciate the work you're doing and your dedication to helping others who may face the challenges you face. So thank you for being part of the Protecting the Nest podcast. And hey, we're going to definitely be in touch and do some more work moving forward. So,
well, that's awesome, Tony, because when I listened to your other podcast in preparation for this one, I got a really good feeling that you were a kindred spirit in terms of those sort of thoughts. So I'm really glad we connected.
That's right. So thank you for those words. And, guys, today we had the privilege of hearing from a dietitian who's now a health coach and who faced cancer, but decided to take an alternative path. I really hope Martha's message inspired you today. And, if you know anyone facing cancer, concerned about cancer, or simply needs some inspiration, I highly recommend you tell them about Martha's book, Hacking Chemo. Knowing that a ketogenic diet and intermittent fasting can impact our lives metabolically is a message more people need to hear. So I promise, like Martha, to continue to do my part to get that message out to as many people as we can. So with that, I hope you enjoyed today's episode, and I look forward to sharing another great episode next week. So until then, I only ask that you be safe, be well, and to continue to protect your nest. You've been listening to Protecting Your Nest with Dr. Tony Hampton. For more, visit drtonyhampton.com.